The dust of Redemption Creek settled on Alara Vance's worn skirts like a second layer of grief. It was a fine, pale dust that smelled of sun-scorched earth and finality. Her husband, Thomas, was buried 200 miles back on a trail that had promised a new life and delivered only a shallow grave. Now she stood alone before the town's mercantile, a single wooden trunk at her feet containing all that was left of their shared dream. The townsfolk moved around her like a river parting around a stone, their glances quick and dismissive. They saw the fraying hem of her dress, the exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes, but most of all, they saw her hands. Her hands were a map of a life lived in service to others, a thin, white line across her right palm from a birthing knife that slipped. A puckered starburst on her left thumb from a poultice applied too hot in haste to draw a fever. The knuckles were red and raw from lye soap and endless scrubbing, the skin crisscrossed with 100 tiny nicks and calluses from tending herbs, delivering foals, and gripping the reins of a wagon for 1,000 unforgiving miles. They were not the hands of a lady, they were the hands of a survivor. And in Redemption Creek, that seemed to be a kind of sin. She sought work first at the dressmaker's shop, but the woman took one look at her hands and shook her head. "You'd snag the silk," she said, her voice thin as thread. At the hotel, the manager eyed the scars and offered a job scrubbing floors, a position that would only deepen the wounds. Alara needed lodging, food, a reason to draw the next breath. She took the job. For a week, she existed in a world of steam, soap, and the ache in her back. The women of the town spoke over her as if she were a piece of furniture, their whispers catching in the humid air of the laundry room. They spoke of a man named Silas Blackwood, a name that carried the weight of land and power. A man who owned the largest ranch in the territory, a man who was as cold and remote as the mountains that shadowed the valley. A widower. It was Mrs. Agatha Finch, the banker's wife and the town's self-appointed moral compass, who made her revulsion plain. She had come to the boarding house for tea, and her gaze landed on Alara's hands as she set down the tray. A small, sharp intake of breath, a tightening of her lips. "Good heavens," she'd murmured, just loud enough for the other ladies to hear. "Look at her hands, utterly ruined." The words were a brand, marking Alara as coarse, common, and unwanted. From then on, the stares were no longer curious but condemning. She was the woman with the scarred hands, a creature of dirt and toil, unfit for polite society. One afternoon, as she wrung out a heavy sheet, the laundry door creaked open. A man stood silhouetted against the harsh sunlight, his frame so large it seemed to swallow the light. He wore dusty boots, denim trousers, and a plain wool coat that spoke of work, not wealth, but the way he held himself radiated an authority that silenced the gossiping women instantly. His face was weathered, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, and a thick, dark beard did little to soften a jawline that looked carved from granite. This had to be Silas Blackwood. He did not look at the women who fluttered and preened for his attention. His gaze swept the room and landed on Alara. He saw her, not as an object to be ignored, but as a person. His eyes dropped to her hands, submerged in the sudsy water. She instinctively tried to hide them, to pull them from sight, but it was too late. He had seen them. She waited for the familiar flicker of distaste, the slight curl of the lip. It never came. Instead, his expression was one of cool assessment, as if he were judging livestock or the quality of a fence post. "I need a cook's assistant at the ranch," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was not addressed to anyone in particular, but his eyes remained on Alara. The boarding house owner bustled forward. "Mr. Blackwood, a pleasure. I have several fine girls who—" But he raised a hand, a gesture that was not unkind, but was utterly final. "You," he said, looking directly at Alara. "Can you work?" She found her voice, a little rusty from disuse. "I can." "Can you start tomorrow?" She nodded, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. He gave a curt nod in return, his business concluded. He was about to turn away when he stopped. The other women held their breath, waiting. He looked at her hands again, which she now held dripping and exposed in the open air. The scars were stark against her pale, water-wrinkled skin. He took a half-step closer, his gaze direct and unnervingly steady. For a moment, she thought he would rescind the offer, that he had finally seen what everyone else saw. Instead, he asked the question that changed everything. What are the scars from? The question was not accusatory. It was not laden with judgment. It was simple, direct curiosity, the kind of question one asks when they genuinely want to know the answer. The air in the room was thick with unspoken shock. No one had ever asked. They had only assumed. Alara met his gaze. "Work," she said, her voice clear. "And healing." A flicker of something, interest perhaps, or surprise, crossed his face. He held her gaze for a second longer, a silent transaction passing between them that she did not understand, but felt deep in her bones. Then he turned and was gone, leaving a wake of stunned silence and the faint scent of leather and dust. Alara looked down at her hands, truly seeing them for the first time not as a mark of shame, but as a testament. Someone had finally bothered to read the map. The Blackwood Ranch was not a place. It was a kingdom. It sprawled across a valley carved by a silver-green river, its fences marching up the sides of pine-stubbled hills until they disappeared into the clouds. The main house was built of thick, dark logs, solid and unpretentious, with a wide porch that looked out over a world Silas Blackwood had built with his own two hands. Alara felt impossibly small as she rode in the wagon beside the ranch foreman, a taciturn man named Jed. The kitchen was a cavernous room, warm and smelling of yeast and wood smoke. The head cook, a plump, no-nonsense woman named Martha, gave Alara a thorough looking over. Her eyes, like everyone else's, lingered on Alara's hands. But Martha, like her employer, saw them differently. "Good," she grunted. "These are hands that know their way around a hot stove. You'll do." Life on the ranch was a rhythm of hard work. From before dawn until after dusk, Alara chopped, stirred, kneaded, and scrubbed. She learned the specific way Mr. Blackwood liked his coffee, black and scalding. She learned the names of the 30 ranch hands who ate like an invading army. She learned the quiet sorrow that hung in the main house like a permanent chill. It was the house of a man who had lost his heart and walled up the empty space. She rarely saw Silas Blackwood himself. He was a phantom. A presence felt more than seen. A glimpse of him riding out at dawn, a heavy silence from his study late at night. But she felt his eyes on her sometimes, a brief, assessing glance from across the yard that made the back of her neck prickle. He never spoke of their first meeting, never asked about her hands again, but the memory of his question was a small, warm coal she kept banked within her. There was another presence in the house, a small, silent girl of about 6 years, Lily, Silas Blackwood's daughter. She was a pale, fragile creature with her father's stormy eyes and a stillness that was unnatural in a child. She would sometimes stand in the doorway of the kitchen, a ghost in a white nightdress, just watching. Martha said the girl hadn't been right since her mother died giving birth to her. A weight of guilt seemed to press down on her small shoulders, a guilt that her father clearly shared. He loved his daughter. Alara could see that in the brief, clumsy way he would touch her hair, but there was a chasm of unspoken grief between them. One blustery afternoon, a commotion erupted from the stables. Shouts, the terrified scream of a horse. Alara ran out, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. One of the ranch's prize mares, a beautiful palomino named Starlight, was down in her stall, struggling with a difficult birth. The foal was breeched. 2 ranch hands were trying to help, but the mare was panicked, kicking wildly. Jed was there, his face grim. Silas Blackwood stood by the stall door, his expression like stone, watching the scene with a cold detachment that felt like despair. "She's not going to make it," one of the hands said, backing away from a flailing hoof. We'll lose them both. Silas's jaw tightened. Then do what you have to. The words were a death sentence for the horse. Something inside Alara snapped. She had seen this before. She knew what to do. Before she could think, she was pushing past the men. Wait, she said, her voice firm. Jed grabbed her arm. Miss Vance, this is no place for you. She shook him off, her eyes fixed on the terrified animal. I can help. She looked directly at Silas, her gaze challenging him. Let me try. For a heartbeat he stared at her, his face unreadable. Then he gave a single sharp nod. The men backed away, leaving her alone with the struggling mare. Ilara entered the stall, murmuring in a low, soothing voice. She didn't approach the horse's head or her dangerous hooves. Instead, she knelt in the straw and began to gently stroke the mare's heaving flank. Her touch was firm, steady. The mare's wild eyes rolled towards her, but she didn't kick. Easy now, girl, Ilara crooned. Easy, I'm here to help you. Just breathe with me. Her scarred hands, the ones the town ladies scorned, went to work. They were not clumsy or coarse. They were knowing, gentle, and incredibly strong. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity, her movements sure and practiced. The men watched in stunned silence. Silas Blackwood leaned against the stall, his arms crossed, his stormy eyes missing nothing. He watched as her hands, covered in the sweat and fluid of birth, did what his men and their brute strength could not. He saw the way the panicked animal calmed under her touch, the way she seemed to speak a language the mare understood. After what felt like an eternity of tense, focused effort, there was a final surge. Ilara, with a strength no one would have guessed she possessed, guided the foal into the world. It lay steaming in the straw, a perfect, long-legged colt. The mare, exhausted but alive, immediately turned her head to lick her newborn. Ilara sat back on her heels, breathing heavily, her arms and apron smeared with evidence of the birth. She looked up and met Silas Blackwood's eyes. The cold detachment was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded expression of awe. He had seen past the scars, past the servant's apron. He had seen the strength within her, the life-giving power in her hands. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. In that moment, the foundation of his walled-off world had begun to crack. She had proven herself not with words, but with action, and he had been there to witness it. The incident with the mare shifted something in the ranch's ecosystem. The ranch hands, who had initially seen her as just another kitchen worker, now looked at her with a grudging respect. Jed would nod to her in the mornings. Martha would save her the choicest cut of bacon. But the most significant change was in the little girl, Lily. The child began to seek Ilara out, appearing silently at her side as she weeded the small patch of ground behind the kitchen where she had started an herb garden. Lily never spoke, but she would watch Ilara's hands as she crumbled soil, planted seeds, and tended the delicate green shoots. She would hand Ilara a trowel or a watering can, her small face serious and intent. Ilara never pushed her to talk. She simply accepted her presence, speaking to her as she spoke to the plants and animals, in a low, calm voice, explaining what she was doing. She was planting chamomile for sleep, mint for upset stomachs, yarrow to staunch bleeding. To Ilara, it was just common knowledge. To the silent child, it was a quiet magic. One evening, the autumn chill turned sharp, and a fierce wind howled down from the mountains. A storm blew in, and with it, a sickness. Lily began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the silent house. By morning, she was burning with fever. Silas sent for Dr. Miller from town, a portly man with a pompous air and hands that smelled of carbolic soap and whiskey. He diagnosed a lung fever, administered a bitter-smelling tonic, and assured Mr. Blackwood the child would be fine. But she was not fine. The fever climbed, leaving Lily delirious and weak. The doctor returned, his confidence wavering, and prescribed bleeding, a suggestion that made Silas's face turn to thunder. Ilara watched from the doorway, her heart aching for the little girl and the helpless father. She recognized this fever. She had seen it on the trail. She knew the doctor's medicines would do nothing. That night, Silas sat by his daughter's bedside, a statue of despair. The great, powerful Silas Blackwood was helpless, terrified of losing the only piece of his wife he had left. He was reliving a nightmare, and the guilt was eating him alive. Ilara approached the room, a steaming mug in her hands. She had dared to overstep her bounds, brewing a tea of willow bark, chamomile, and elderflower from her garden. She paused at the door. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. "What is it?" "This might help," she said, holding out the mug. "It will bring the fever down gently and help her sleep." He stared at the mug, then at her. He was a man who trusted no one, a man who had been betrayed by fate itself. But he had seen what her hands could do. He had seen her coax life from a dying mare. He was desperate. He took the mug without a word. Ilara showed him how to lift Lily's head and help her sip the warm liquid. The child, lost in her fever dreams, drank it down. Ilara expected to be dismissed, to be sent back to the kitchen. Instead, Silas gestured to a chair on the other side of the bed. "Stay," he commanded, his voice rough with emotion. So she stayed. They sat in silence as the grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the long hours. They were two solitary people, a man locked in his grief, and a woman who had lost everything, united by their concern for one small, fragile life. Sometime before dawn, Lily's breathing eased. A light sheen of sweat broke on her forehead. The fever had broken. Ilara felt Silas's eyes on her. She looked up to see him watching her, the raw vulnerability in his gaze stealing her breath. "Thank you," he whispered. It was more than gratitude. It was an admission of need, a crack in the wall of ice around his heart. He did not speak of it again, but things continued to shift. A few days later, Ilara went out to her herb garden to find it enclosed by a new, sturdy fence of peeled pine logs, built with a craftsman's care. It would keep out the stray chickens and any curious calves. She knew, without asking, who had built it. He had seen what was important to her and protected it. The gesture was more eloquent than 1,000 words. The slow burn of their connection was built on such silences. It was in the way he started taking his coffee in the kitchen in the morning, leaning against the doorframe just to be in the same room with her. It was in the way she found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch, her heart giving a little skip when she heard them. They worked side by side one afternoon, mending a section of fence near the house. The rhythm of their labor was a conversation in itself, a shared purpose that needed no words. He passed her a tool, and their fingers brushed. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that shot up her arm and settled deep in her chest. Neither of them acknowledged it, but both of them felt it. The weather grew colder. One morning, Ilara was hanging laundry on the line, the wet sheets stiffening in the frigid air. Her shawl was thin, and she shivered, her breath pluming in front of her. She didn't hear him approach. He was suddenly just there, behind her. He took off his own heavy sheepskin-lined coat and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was heavy, warm, and smelled of him. Leather, wood smoke, and the clean scent of the cold outdoors. It enveloped her like an embrace. "You'll catch your death," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. His hands rested on her shoulders for a moment, keeping the coat in place. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. She could feel the heat of his body, the strength in his hands. She closed her eyes, leaning back into the solid warmth of his presence. The world seemed to stop. There was only the creak of the clothesline, the bite of the wind, and the steady beat of his heart so close to her. He was no longer just her employer. He was Silas. And she was falling for him, despite every reason she had to guard her own broken heart. The fragile peace of their unspoken understanding was not destined to last. News of Lily's recovery and Alara's role in it traveled to town. It was carried by ranch hands picking up supplies, and it twisted and soured with every telling. In the righteous parlors of Redemption Creek, Elara Vance was no longer just the woman with the scarred hands. She was a charlatan, a hedge witch who had somehow ensnared the territory's most eligible widower. Mrs. Agatha Finch led the charge. Her own niece, a pale and perpetually disappointed girl named Clara, had been her chosen candidate to become the next Mrs. Blackwood. Elara's presence at the ranch was an affront to the natural order of things. Agatha saw a coarse, uneducated servant worming her way into a position of power, and she would not stand for it. "It's unnatural," she declared over tea at the Mercantile. "That woman uses folk remedies and potions. She's likely poisoned the poor child's mind, making her dependent. Silas Blackwood is blinded by grief, and she is taking advantage of him." Dr. Miller, his professional pride stung by the story of his failure and her success, eagerly fanned the flames. "These country remedies are dangerous," he pronounced loudly at the saloon. "There's no science to them. It was a coincidence, nothing more. Or worse, she's using some kind of witchcraft to make it seem she has a power she does not." The whispers grew into a chorus of condemnation. Elara felt the change in the air when she had to ride into town for supplies. The shopkeepers were curt. The women turned their backs as she passed. The very dust seemed to cling with a new malice. She was an outsider, a threat, and the town was closing ranks against her. Silas was aware of the rumors. She saw it in the tightening of his jaw when a townsman would fall silent as he approached, in the way his eyes would go cold and hard. But he said nothing of it to her. He retreated into himself, building his walls higher as if to protect the fragile connection growing between them from the town's poison. His silence, meant to shield her, felt like a chasm opening between them. The threat became terrifyingly real when Lily fell ill again. It started with the same cough, the same fever. But this time, it was worse. The child's breathing was shallow, her small body racked with tremors. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Silas. He sent for Dr. Miller again, perhaps to prove the town wrong, or perhaps because his fear drove him back to conventional authority. Dr. Miller arrived with Mrs. Finch in tow, a self-appointed chaperone of decency. They swept into the house, their faces grim with a kind of triumphant pity. The doctor examined Lily, his pronouncements loud enough for the entire household to hear. "It's as I feared," he said, shaking his head. "The girl's constitution has been weakened by those concoctions. Whatever that woman gave her created this relapse." Agatha Finch stepped forward, her eyes glittering with righteous fury. She pointed a finger at Elara, who stood helplessly in the hall. "You see, Mr. Blackwood, this is what happens when you allow an ungodly woman to practice her dark arts in a Christian home. You must send her away. For your daughter's sake, for your own reputation, the town demands it." It was an ultimatum. Her or his standing. Her or his child's safety, as defined by them. Elara looked at Silas, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the war in his eyes, the terror for his daughter, the weight of his position, the pressure of the community he had to live in. He was a powerful man, but even he could not stand against the entire town. She saw the flicker of doubt, the instinct to retreat to what was known and safe. He looked from the doctor's confident face to Agatha's smug one, then to his gasping child. Finally, his gaze fell on Elara. It was filled with a terrible, tearing conflict. And then he made his choice. "Elara," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all the warmth she had come to know. "Go to the kitchen. Stay away from Lily." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had not defended her. He had not trusted her. He had chosen them. He had retreated back into his cold, closed-off fortress and locked the gate behind him. The fragile trust they had built lay shattered at her feet. She was once again the outsider, the woman with the scarred hands, the unwanted stranger. The silence that followed his command was heavier than any sound. Ilara turned without a word, her back straight, her head held high, and walked away. But inside, her world had crumbled to dust. She had allowed herself to hope, to feel safe, to imagine a home. It had all been an illusion. She was a fool to think a man like Silas Blackwood could ever truly choose a woman like her. A fool to think her hands could ever build anything but a wall of scorn around her. She didn't go to the kitchen. She went to her small room off the laundry. Her movements were stiff, automatic. She pulled her old wooden trunk from under the bed. The hinges groaned in the quiet. There was nothing left for her here. To stay would be to endure the daily humiliation of his choice, to see the triumph in Agatha Finch's eyes, to watch the child she had come to love fade away under the doctor's inept care. Worse, her presence was now a danger to Silas himself. They would use her to ruin him. She would not allow that. She packed her few belongings: the worn dress, her mother's book of herbs, the small carved bird Thomas had given her on their wedding day. Her hands, her cursed, scarred hands, trembled as she folded her apron. She would leave before dawn. She would walk until she could walk no more, disappear back into the wilderness that had almost claimed her once before. It was better to be alone in the wild than to be alone in a house full of people where she was no longer wanted. The pain was a cold, hard knot in her chest, a grief deeper than any she had known, even when she had buried her husband. She had not realized until this moment, until she had lost it, that she had fallen in love with Silas Blackwood. The house was quiet with the tense, waiting hush of a death vigil. Ilara sat on the edge of her cot, her trunk packed, watching the moonlight paint a silver square on the rough wooden floor. She was waiting for the house to fall into a deep sleep before she slipped away. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind, felt like a judgment. He had retreated into his damage, and she was the collateral. The connection she thought they had, the unspoken language that had passed between them, was gone, destroyed by fear and public opinion. This was her lowest point. Lower than arriving in town with nothing, because then she had nothing to lose. Now, she had lost a future she had just begun to imagine. A sudden cry shattered the silence. A child's scream of pure terror, followed by a crash, and Silas's voice, shouting his daughter's name in a tone of raw panic. Ilara was on her feet in an instant, her own pain forgotten. She ran from her room, down the darkened hall towards the light spilling from Lily's doorway. The scene was chaos. Lily was in the grip of a violent seizure, her small body rigid and convulsing. She had knocked over a bedside table, and a pitcher of water lay shattered on the floor. Dr. Miller stood back, his face pale and useless. "It's the fever taking her brain," he stammered. "There's nothing to be done." Silas was kneeling by the bed, his hands hovering over his daughter, terrified to touch her. His face was a mask of agony, the face of a man watching lightning strike the same place twice. He looked up and saw Ilara in the doorway. His eyes, wild with desperation, locked with hers. In that moment, all the pride, all the fear of the town, all the walls he had built were annihilated by the primal terror of a father about to lose his child. He saw not the town pariah, but the one person who had saved her before. "Help her," he begged, his voice cracking, the words a raw plea torn from the depths of his soul. "Ilara, please." It was his public choice. In front of the doctor who had condemned her, he was choosing her. He was admitting his need, his helplessness, his trust. And in that same instant, Ilara made her own choice. She could walk away. She could save herself the heartache and let him live with the consequences of his earlier decision. But looking at the convulsing child, at the broken man on the floor, she knew she could not. Running was survival. Staying was a fight. She chose to fight. She moved into the room, her presence calm and authoritative. "Get hot water and every blanket in the house," she commanded the housekeeper who hovered in the hall. To Silas she said, "Hold her head, gently, just so she doesn't hurt herself." Her voice cut through his panic, giving him a task, grounding him. She ignored Dr. Miller completely. She worked with a fierce, swift efficiency. This was her strength. The knowledge in her hands and her head, deployed without hesitation. She crushed herbs, creating a pungent paste to rub on the child's chest and feet. When the blankets arrived, she soaked them in hot water, wrung them out, and wrapped Lily's limbs, forcing the heat to the surface to fight the fever's core. She pried the girl's clenched jaw open just enough to spoon a few drops of a potent valerian tincture onto her tongue to calm the seizure. For over an hour, she fought for the child's life. Silas never left her side, following her every instruction, his eyes never leaving her face, his trust in her absolute. He watched her scarred hands, not as symbols of coarseness, but as instruments of a fierce and gentle power. He saw the knowledge, the courage, the grace in them. He saw everything he had been blind to. Slowly, miraculously, the seizure subsided. Lily's body went limp, her breathing ragged but steady. The terrible heat began to recede from her skin. Ilara collapsed into a chair, slick with sweat, utterly spent. The crisis had passed. Lily was sleeping, a true, healing sleep. The silence in the room was profound. Dr. Miller, his face a mottled red of humiliation, tried to speak. "A temporary fluke." Silas rose to his full height, turning to face the doctor. The grief and fear on his face had been replaced by a cold, quiet rage. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And if you ever speak a word against this woman again, I will personally tear down everything you have built in this town." The doctor paled and practically fled the room. "Now," Silas turned to Ilara. He walked over to her, his boots silent on the wooden floor. He knelt before her chair, a gesture of supplication that stunned her. He took her hands in his, her tired, stained, scarred hands. He held them not gently, but with a reverence that made her want to weep. He lifted them to his face, pressing his cheek against her rough knuckles. "These hands," he said, his voice thick with emotion, the words meant for her, but loud enough for anyone listening to hear. The whole town looked at these hands and saw shame. I looked at them and was a blind fool. He looked up, his stormy eyes shining with unshed tears. "They saved my daughter. They delivered my finest colt. They built a garden from nothing. Ilara, they saved me." It was his revelation, the public vindication. He was not just choosing her. He was declaring her worth to the world and to himself. He was tearing down the warrant of public opinion, defying the judgment of the town. He was putting down his pride for her. And in saving his child, she had rescued him from the prison of his own grief. The rescue was mutual. The glass slipper was not a shoe. It was the truth of who she was. A truth he now saw and proclaimed. The spring that followed was a season of quiet healing. Mrs. Agatha Finch, publicly shamed by Silas's declaration and the doctor's hasty retreat from prominence, found her social power greatly diminished. The whispers against Ilara died out, replaced by a grudging, then a genuine respect. Women would now occasionally stop her in town, not to scorn her hands, but to ask her advice about a colicky baby or a stubborn cough. She was no longer an outsider. Ilara never moved out of her small room. Instead, Silas moved her belongings, trunk and all, into the master bedroom next to his own. Her book of herbs now sat on the fine mahogany nightstand. Her simple dress hung in the wardrobe next to his coats. The house, once chilled by sorrow, began to warm with life. Laughter was heard in the halls. Lily's at first, a sound as bright and welcome as a spring robin. And then, slowly, Silas's own deep rumble. He had opened himself up, sharing the story of his first wife, not with the crushing guilt of before, but with a gentle sadness that Alara helped him bear. He learned to speak her name, to tell Lily stories of the mother she never knew. In teaching him how to grieve, Alara had healed a wound far deeper than any she could treat with herbs. One evening, they sat on the porch swing, a comfortable silence between them as they watched the sun set fire to the clouds. Lily was in the yard, laughing as she tried to coax the young colt Alara had saved to eat a carrot from her hand. The herb garden was flourishing, a patch of vibrant green against the dark soil. The whole world felt peaceful, settled. Silas reached over and took her hand. His large, calloused palm enveloped hers. He traced the thin white line on her palm, the puckered starburst on her thumb. He did it not with pity, but with a familiar tenderness that felt more intimate than any kiss. I used to think strength was about building fences, about owning land, about never needing anyone, he said, his voice soft. You taught me it's about mending what's broken. You mended my daughter. You mended this house. You mended me. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt familiar and comforting. And you gave me a place to plant my roots, she whispered. She was no longer the woman running from her past, the widow with nothing but a trunk. This was her home, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had chosen to stay, and he had chosen her. He turned his head, his beard brushing against her temple. Alara Vance, he said, his voice full of a quiet, irreversible conviction. Will you be Alara Blackwood? Will you be my wife? She lifted her head to look at him, to see the love and certainty in his stormy eyes. She didn't need to speak. Her answer was in the way she smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. It was in the way she leaned in and finally, gently, pressed her lips to his. The frontier was still wild, the world still held its dangers, but here, on this porch, in the circle of his arms, she was safe. She was home. The woman with the scarred hands was no longer unwanted. She was cherished. She was loved.